Hey guys, go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights, pull up the blankets, and maybe set your phone face down. Tonight, we're going to wander through some very quiet, very dusty corridors of history. We're looking for someone who wasn't exactly a ghost, but was treated like one while she was still breathing. We're talking about a woman who should have been at the center of the world's most glittering court, but instead, she became a footnote, a what if whispered behind fans. Tonight, we're looking at the strange, lonely life of the Iron Mask Princess, a royal daughter who was effectively erased from history by the very people who should have loved her. So just breathe, relax, and let's drift back to 17th century France. The story starts, as so many tragic royal tales do, with a marriage that was less about true love and more about not having another war with Spain. We're at the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King. Now, Louis was many things. He was a ballet enthusiast, a man who thought wearing 4-inch heels and a massive wig made him look like a god, and someone who believed the entire universe revolved around his breakfast schedule. He was also married to Maria Theresa of Spain. Poor Maria Theresa. She was sweet, she was pious, and she was, bless her heart, not exactly the sharpest tool in the Bourbon shed. She spent most of her time eating chocolate, praying, and trying to ignore the fact that her husband had a rotating door of official mistresses who were all taller, wittier, and more influential than she was. In the hierarchy of Versailles, Maria Theresa was somewhere between a very important piece of furniture and a biological necessity for producing heirs. But in 1664, something happened that made the gossips of Versailles stop whispering about the king's latest girlfriend and start staring at the queen's belly. Maria Theresa was pregnant with her third child. Everything should have been fine. The king was happy, the church was happy, and the doctors, who at the time mostly treated people by bleeding them or suggesting they smell a dead goat, were cautiously optimistic. But then came the birth. On November 16, 1664, the queen went into labor. Now, royal births back then were not private affairs. They were a spectator sport. You'd have dukes, duchesses, and random officials just hanging around the bedroom because you had to make sure the baby wasn't swapped for a peasant's kid in a laundry basket. It was crowded, it was hot, and it was loud. The queen gave birth to a daughter, Marie Anne of France. But as the doctors leaned in, the room went dead silent. The king took one look at the infant and, according to the memoirs of the time, looked like he'd just swallowed a lemon. The baby was different. Specifically, her skin was described as being very, very dark. The official line, because when you're the Sun King, you can just make up science, was that the queen had looked at a Moorish servant too many times, or perhaps she'd eaten too much dark chocolate, and the pigment had simply migrated to the baby, because obviously that's how biology works. If you look at a lemon, you'll have a yellow baby. It's just common sense, 17th century style. But the court didn't buy it. The whispers started immediately. Was it a medical condition? Was it a sign of divine displeasure? Or was there a secret hidden in the queen's private chambers? The king, being a man who valued his ego above all else, decided the best way to handle this medical anomaly was to make it go away. Not away in a violent sense, Louis wasn't that crude, but away in the sense of a royal vanishing act. The little princess was officially declared dead shortly after birth. There was a funeral, there was a small coffin, there were prayers. But here's the thing about dead royal babies in the 1600s. Sometimes they didn't stay in the ground, they just moved house. While the court moved on to the next scandal, a young girl was being raised in total secrecy at a convent in Marais-sur-Loing. She wasn't a peasant. She was dressed in fine fabrics, she was educated, and most tellingly, she was visited by members of the high nobility who would never ever visit a random orphan. She became known as the Black Nun of Marais. Imagine growing up in a stone room surrounded by quiet, praying women and having people occasionally show up in silk carriages just to stare at you with a mix of pity and horror. You're told you're special, but you're also told you can never leave. You're a princess in a cage of incense and silence. The king's official children were living in Versailles, eating off gold plates and having people bow to their shoes. Meanwhile, Marie Anne, if that's who she really was learning to sew and chant. She knew who she was, though. Later in life, when the king's son, the Grand Dauphin, visited her, she reportedly called him brother. He didn't correct her. He just looked at her with that heavy, tired bourbon gaze and left. It's the ultimate gaslighting, to be told you don't exist while you're looking at your own reflection, to see the king's face on every coin in your purse and realize that's your father, but if you ever said it out loud, you'd be considered insane or a traitor. The Iron Mask princess wasn't wearing a physical mask, but she was draped in a veil of forced obscurity. She was a living secret, a personification of a royal oops. And as the Sun King's reign grew longer and more bloated, the girl in the convent grew older, her existence becoming a quiet, persistent thrum in the background of French history, a reminder that even the most powerful man in the world couldn't quite control the truth, no matter how many funerals he staged. Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a long, slow walk through the fog of 16th century Hungary. So go ahead and dim the lights, find your most comfortable spot, and let's settle in. We're going to be talking about someone who has become a bit of a bedtime legend herself, though maybe not the relaxing kind, the Countess Elizabeth Bathory. You've probably heard her called the Blood Countess, or maybe you've heard the stories about her bathing in the blood of hundreds of young girls to stay young. But as we're going to find out, history is often much more complicated and a lot more boringly bureaucratic than the vampire stories suggest. We're going to look at her life not as a horror movie, but as a series of strange, tragic, and deeply dysfunctional events in a world where being a powerful woman was basically a crime in itself. So let's just relax and let the story unfold. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into the Bathory family, which was, to put it mildly, the 16th century equivalent of being born into a family of incredibly wealthy, slightly unhinged superheroes. They owned half of Hungary and Transylvania. They produced kings and princes. They also produced people like Elizabeth's uncle, Stephen Bathory, who was the king of Poland, and her other uncle, who was rumored to worship the devil, because, when you're that rich, you need a hobby. Elizabeth grew up in a castle called Exid, and from the very beginning, her life was a bit of a genetic lottery. The Bathorys were famous for their beauty, their intelligence, and their, let's call them, intense temperaments, because when you marry your cousins as often as the Bathorys did, you're bound to get some interesting personality traits along with the family silver. She was reportedly highly educated, speaking Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek. This was a bit of a problem in the 1500s because a woman who knew more than her husband was often seen as a bit suspicious. At the age of 15, which was basically middle-aged for marriage back then, she was wed to Ferenc Nadasdy. Ferenc was known as the Black Knight of Hungary. He spent most of his time fighting the Ottomans, which meant he was rarely home. Elizabeth was left to run their massive estates, manage thousands of servants, and deal with the local peasantry. This is where the monotony of power starts to set in. Imagine being a brilliant, slightly bored teenager in charge of several massive castles while your husband is away decapitating people for a living. It's not exactly a recipe for a balanced social life. Elizabeth and Ferenc had several children, but Ferenc eventually died in 1604, leaving Elizabeth a very wealthy, very powerful, and very lonely widow. And this is where the stories start to get weird. According to the legends, the ones that would eventually be written down years after her death, Elizabeth began to descend into a sort of ritualistic madness. The famous story is that she hit a servant girl, and some of the girl's blood splashed on Elizabeth. Elizabeth supposedly noticed that her skin looked younger where the blood had touched it. So, naturally, instead of buying a nice moisturizer, she decided the best anti-aging routine was to drain 650 people of their life force and take a bath in it. Now, let's pause there for a second. If you're trying to relax, just think about the sheer logistics of that. Draining 650 people would take a lot of work. You'd need a lot of plumbing, a lot of cleanup, and a very quiet neighborhood. In reality, there is zero contemporary evidence that she ever bathed in blood. It wasn't even mentioned in her trial. That part of the story was added about 100 years later by a Jesuit priest, who probably just wanted to make the story more vampiric. But back in the 1600s, people didn't need bloodbaths to think Elizabeth was up to no good. They just needed her to be a powerful widow who owed the king a lot of money. King Matthias II of Hungary owed Elizabeth's late husband a staggering amount of debt. If Elizabeth were to be found guilty of, say, being a serial killer, her lands could be confiscated and the king wouldn't have to pay her back. It's funny how often justice in the Middle Ages aligned perfectly with not paying your bills. In 1610, King Matthias ordered Gurgi Thorza, the Palatine of Hungary, to investigate the rumors surrounding the countess. Thorza was actually a relative of Elizabeth's, but in the world of high-stakes Hungarian politics, family meant you were just the person most likely to stab her in the back. Thorza claimed he caught her in the act during a surprise raid on Csészej Castle. He said he found one girl dead, one dying, and several others locked in the dungeons. But again, the official reports are a bit fuzzy. There were no lawyers for Elizabeth. There was no cross-examination. Instead, they arrested her servants, poor people who were tortured until they said exactly what the investigators wanted to hear. They confessed to all sorts of things. Elizabeth using needles, Elizabeth using fire, Elizabeth being a general nightmare. One servant even claimed the Countess had a book where she recorded the names of all 650 victims. This book has never been found, which is a bit of a recurring theme in Elizabeth's life. Lots of claims, very few receipts. Because she was a noblewoman, Elizabeth couldn't be executed or even put on trial in a public court. That would have been embarrassing for the other nobles. Instead, she was simply walled up in her own castle. They bricked up the windows and doors of her room, leaving only a small slit for food and air. She spent the last 4 years of her life in total darkness, listening to the wind howl through the Carpathian Mountains. It wasn't a dramatic end. It was a slow, quiet, monotone fading away. She died in 1614 at the age of 54, found by a guard who noticed her food hadn't been touched. So was she a monster or a victim of a massive political conspiracy? Probably a bit of both. It's likely she was cruel to her servants, most nobles were, and Elizabeth had a legendary temper. But the vampire stuff? That was likely the 1600s version of a smear campaign designed to take her money. And so, the Blood Countess remains a figure of shadow, a woman whose true face is hidden behind centuries of stories designed to make us shiver, even as we drift off to sleep. Let's float over to another royal disaster, one that's a bit less bloody, but much more genetically confusing. We're moving from the mountains of Hungary to the sun-drenched but very dusty palaces of Spain. We need to talk about the Habsburgs again, but specifically about a man who makes Charles II look like a marathon runner. We're going to look at the life of someone who was so productively inbred that his family tree was basically just a straight line. The sun finally set on the Sun King in 1715, after 72 years of ruling France, wearing increasingly heavy wigs, and turning the country into the world's most expensive stage play. Louis XIV died of gangrene. And you'd think, Wouldn't you? That with the great gaslighter gone, the secret of the Black Nun would finally be aired out. That maybe the new administration would say, okay, let's bring her home and give her a nice apartment in the Louvre. But that's not how royalty works. Royalty is a bit like a game of Jenga. If you pull out one piece of the official narrative, the whole tower of divine right starts to wobble. The regency took over, led by Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. Philippe was a man who famously loved two things: debauched parties and chemistry. He was much more relaxed than his uncle Louis, but even he knew that some skeletons were better left in their respective convents. However, he was curious. He actually visited Louise Marie at Moray shortly after the old king's death. It's said that when he saw her, he was struck by how much she sounded like the late queen. It wasn't just the words, it was the cadence, the subtle Spanish lilt that Maria Theresa never quite lost, and that specific, heavy-lidded bourbon gaze. He continued her pension, of course. In fact, he increased it, because if there's one thing a royal family is good at, it's paying for silence with someone else's tax money. Louise Marie was now in her 50s. She had spent nearly half a century behind those walls. By this point, she wasn't just a secret, she was a fixture of the landscape. She had outlived the king, the queen, and most of the people who had been in that birth chamber back in 1664. She was a living relic of a scandal that everyone remembered, but no one was allowed to document. There's a story from this period, one of those quiet, slightly heartbreaking moments where a young noble asked her why she never tried to leave. She allegedly looked out the window at the gardens and said, "Where would I go? I am a ghost, and ghosts don't have houses. They only have the places where they died." It's a bit dramatic, sure, but after 50 years of being told you're a clerical error, you're allowed a little flair. Now, we have to talk about the Iron Mask connection. Voltaire, the famous philosopher and professional pot stirrer, was the one who really kicked this into high gear. He was obsessed with the man in the Iron Mask, the mysterious prisoner who was moved from fortress to fortress in a velvet, not iron, but iron sounds cooler, mask. Voltaire's theory was that the prisoner was a brother of Louis XIV. But as historians started digging through the archives centuries later, they noticed something weird. The timing of the Iron Mask's imprisonment and the birth of the Black Nun overlapped in some very suspicious ways. Some suggested the man was actually a cover for the daughter, or that the two secrets were intertwined. If the king was willing to bury a daughter in a convent, what would he do to a brother? The palace was less a home and more a high-end witness protection program for people who shared the king's nose. As Louise Marie entered her final years, she became deeply involved in the life of the abbey. She was a woman of immense piety, which was probably the only thing that kept her sane. She spent her days in the chapel, her dark skin a stark contrast against the white marble and the flickering candles. She died in 1732. She was 68 years old, which was a remarkably long run for someone who was dead at birth. She was buried under the flagstones of the church at Moray-sur-Loing. No grand monument, no Daughter of France title on her tomb, just a simple stone for a woman who lived a life of gilded invisibility. When the French Revolution rolled around a decade later, the revolutionaries, who were very big on digging up dead royals to see if they had any gold teeth, actually looked for her records. They found the pension files, they found the letters from the Queen's confidants, but the body of the Black Nun remained a mystery. In the chaos of the 1990s, the abbey was ransacked and many of the graves were disturbed. It's almost poetic in a very dry, sleepy way. She spent her life being erased, and in the end, history finished the job. She's now a shadow in the archives, a woman who might have been a queen or a princess, or just a very inconvenient reminder that even the Sun King couldn't control the colors of his own court. So, since we're already in the neighborhood of royal disasters, let's float over to a different kind of erasure. While the Iron Mask princess was hidden away because of how she looked, our next group of royals was hidden, well, in plain sight, despite looking like they'd been assembled from a kit with missing instructions. We're moving from the Bourbons of France to their neighbors and frequent cousins, the Spanish Habsburgs. If the Bourbons were the masters of the secret child, the Habsburgs were the masters of the secret family tree, mostly because their family tree was actually just a very tall, very sad hedge. Go ahead and adjust your pillow. We're going to talk about the physical cost of power. You see, back then, if you were a king, you didn't want to marry a stranger. Strangers were dangerous. Strangers wanted your land. So you married your cousin, or your niece, or your cousin's niece. It kept the blue blood pure, but it also turned that blood into something more like a thick, genetic sludge. Let's talk about the face that launched 1,000 sighs, the Habsburg jaw. You've probably seen the portraits, the kings with the lower jaws that seem to be trying to leave their faces, and the lips that don't quite meet. It wasn't just a family look, like having a big nose. It was a condition called mandibular prognathism. And by the time we get to the 17th century, it wasn't just a quirk, it was a catastrophe. Take Philip IV of Spain. Now, Philip was actually a decent guy by royal standards. He loved art, he patronized Velázquez, and he spent a lot of time feeling guilty about his various sins. But Philip's face was a journey. He had a jaw so heavy and a lip so thick that he reportedly couldn't chew his food properly. He just sort of mashed it. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world and being defeated by a piece of steak. But the real crown jewel of this genetic pileup was Philip's son, Charles II of Spain. Poor, poor Charles. If history were a movie, Charles would be the character everyone just wants to give a warm blanket and a nap. He was born in 1661, and from day one, it was clear that the Habsburg strategy of marrying your own relatives had hit a wall, a very hard biological wall. Charles was known as El Hechizado, or the Bewitched, because of course the people of the 17th century couldn't possibly blame the fact that his mother was also his father's niece. No, it had to be a curse. Someone must have put a spell on him. It's a very convenient way to avoid looking at your own marriage certificates. Charles didn't speak until he was 4, he didn't walk until he was 8, he was short, lame, and his jaw was so oversized that his tongue didn't fit in his mouth, which meant he drooled constantly. He was, quite literally, the physical embodiment of a dynasty that had run out of steam. And yet, because he was the king, everyone had to pretend he was a shimmering example of majestic power. They'd dress him in silks and jewels, sit him on a throne, and hope he didn't fall off. The diplomats who visited the court wrote home in code, saying things like, "The king is, well, he's definitely here. He's very small. He looks like he's made of wax that's been left in the sun too long." The irony here is that while the Iron Mask princess was tucked away in a convent to protect a reputation, Charles II was put on display to protect a throne. One was a secret because of a perceived stain, and the other was a disaster because of purity. Charles's life was a long, slow exercise in survival. He couldn't chew, his stomach was always upset, and he suffered from what we now recognize as a host of genetic disorders. But he hung on. He lived to be 38, which frankly was a miracle of modern, or rather very ancient, medicine. The most sleepless historian part of this? Charles was obsessed with his ancestors. Toward the end of his life, he actually asked to have the royal tombs at the Escorial opened so he could look at the bodies of his relatives. He wanted to see the people who had made him, him. He stood there, looking at the decaying remains of his father and grandfather, perhaps seeing the same heavy jaws and the same tragic genetic legacy. It's a quiet, eerie image. The last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a man who could barely stand, staring into the open coffins of the people who had doomed him before he was even born.